With a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to study about country living. And Lord, as we talk about some simple practical things to think about when looking at country property, we pray that you would guide us, direct us. In Jesus' name, amen. And the first thing that I would suggest in looking for country property is pretty obvious. Pray. Because some of the things that I may share may not be as important to you in your situation. You want to do what God says, not what Chad says. I'm just giving you some practical things that could help you so you don't get in a bad situation with country property. So the Bible says in Isaiah 30:21, I will instruct thee and teach thee in the way which thou shalt go. I will guide thee with mine eye. God says, I'm going to guide you with my eye. So God knows the future. He knows everything. And allow God to lead you. And the whole process, I don't just mean pray today or pray at the beginning and then go forward. Pray the whole way through the process. And we'll come back to that. But prayer is extremely important. The other thing that I said already before is, if you are interested in country property and you don't have money, I don't know the legalities here. Actually, in some ways I know a little bit. I know that Europe is actually more open generally to allowing people to walk around than the United States. Like, we have signs up all over, no trespassing. And you can't walk down the path, you know, and you just can't do it. There are areas where you can. But I know a lot of Europe, there's paths where you can walk by, you can walk even on people's properties in some cases, And so, even if you don't have the money and you really have a burden for country living, you could look online, see a property like land. You wouldn't go in somebody's house without calling a realtor, but you could go by the property and you could look at it or you could walk near it and see what it looks like just to get an idea. Because I really believe the more you look, the better able you are to understand what you may be looking for. And I've also found that things look great on the internet. And then you get there, and often you realize, whoa, this is not what I was looking for. And so sometimes people buy properties without ever even going there. They just saw the pictures. And I found one family that it worked out okay. But many times, that's not going to work out. Maybe you see the house, and maybe because you could either buy just land or you buy a house, either way. But maybe you see the house and you're like, wow, that looks beautiful. And you get inside and it's filled with mold, but you couldn't see that in the pictures. So it's too unhealthy to live in. Well, maybe it can be fixed, but it's a lot of work and it can make you sick just fixing it. So just letting you know, it's wise. Personally, I wouldn't buy a house without seeing it first. I wouldn't buy land without seeing it first. But, maybe God will lead you otherwise, but most of the time, you want to go see it. So, this is a question. If you're looking for country property, you've prayed, do you want to build or do you want to find a property that already has a built house? There's benefits in both of them. Obviously, a built house is nice because you just move in. That's great. If it's clean and it's not filled with mold, if it's healthy enough to move into, wonderful. If you can do that and if you have enough money, that can be a great way of doing it. And depending on where you move and depending on the time in Earth's history, when I built in 2018, 19, it was probably cheaper actually for us to build than buy. But it's not always that way. A lot of times it's the opposite. It's cheaper to build or buy something the house that's already there than build. So you have to look at your region, the timing, what would be better. We actually built because the houses we could afford were moldy. But we could build a small house and we could afford it, and the hope was it's built, so it shouldn't, hopefully, you're trying to make it not a moldy house. But so you have to make that decision, and you're doing that with prayer. One of the first things to look at in a property is that it is high ground. And when I say that, I know there's no in most of the Netherlands, you don't have super high ground, but there is low ground where you'd be wet. You understand? And wet, having that moisture causes mold problems. So when I say high ground, it doesn't have to be way up necessarily in a mountain, but you want to make sure it's not in, we call a flood zone or a flood plain. Because some areas, you may go and look at them and you go, wow, look at this. Man, we could have a garden, we could put our house here, and you don't realize that this area will flood every 50 years or 100 years. And so you probably don't, I mean, you probably have different websites in Europe than we do. We have a common one in the United States. Here's a, like, I'm looking at a property on Realtor.com. This doesn't work for me, but I'm just giving you an example. So let's say I was looking at this property, and I'm not. I just picked this as an example. And I say, wow, this looks good. You know, there's a nice creek here down at the bottom. There's a road, so you'd be able to get there, no problem. And man, we could just put our house right here. This would be okay. And we'd have all this nice field, and there's a setting on our website where if I set, show me the flood zone, I do that, and guess what happens? Well, what would happen if I would have put my house there? And you may not have a website, maybe you do like this in your country, I don't know, but typically, at least in the United States, you can go to like government offices and they can show you maps of flood zones. So that is one of the most important things. I had someone call me after watching one of my videos on our YouTube channel, and they said, I just bought, I don't know, 7 acres, and I didn't realize it was all a flood zone. So they can't have a house there. Or they could. The only way you would do it is you put it on stilts, you know, like big, big pieces of wood, and you have nothing on the ground, so the house is above the ground. I mean, you could do that, but it's hard to have a garden there because maybe it's going to flood and you lose all your food. So they realized they had to sell the property. So this is one of the most important things to find. And some places you have such a hill you can tell, no, this is never going to flood. I mean, it's just such a hill. There's no way. I mean, unless Noah comes back, you know, it's not going to flood this high. So, but there are maps that can help you find that. Second thing that's just about as important is what is your water source going to be? And remember, not everyone has to immediately be way out in the middle of nowhere. Some of you may just be in a little village, you know, with land next to it. You know, that may be the way you do it. And so maybe you already have city water. But if you find land and it doesn't have water already, how are you going to get it? Are you going to try to have city water brought to it? Are you going to have a well put in? You're going to have a company come put a well in. Drill. Some places you can actually, there's ways you can do it yourself. But depending on what country you're in, I'm guessing in some of these wealthier countries, it's probably not legal just to do it yourself. So, but you could find out. And you also want to find out how much will it cost to get the water? How much would a well cost? Like in the United States, some wells may cost, a super cheap well might be $3,000. An expensive well might be $75,000. That's a lot of money. And if you're in an area that's going to be a $75,000 well, if you have a ton of money, that may be okay. But if you don't, you may say, well, I don't have enough money for a house and a well. So you need to look into how much will it cost to get the water. Or maybe you live in an area with a stream, and depending on where you live, it may be illegal to take the water out for water, but it may be legal. So these are things you need to try to figure out, and each country is going to have a little bit different ways of figuring that out. So I can't tell you how each nation has the legalities, but you want to find out what you can do with the water. If it has water on it, can you use it? Do you have a spring? Do you have a creek? Do you need a well? Or do you have city water? Or the other option is rain catchment, you know, where the water comes down on the roof and you catch it, but you need to make sure that you get enough rain to be able to do that. So these are all very, very important things to consider. Also, and I'll explain what this means, is it going to be on-grid or off-grid, and the price of that. What is on-grid? On-grid means you're hooked to the city or the government electricity. That's on grid. You're connected to the electrical grid, right? And off grid means you're not connected, so maybe you have solar power, or maybe you have wind power, which is not very efficient, or water power, hydroelectric from a creek. So there's different ways to do it, but you also have to consider how much is that going to cost, and how are you going to run things. And each of you has to make your own decisions. I don't think it's wise for me or anybody else to tell you exactly what you should do. But these are questions you need to ask so that you, for yourself, can do what you would wish. Now, to be the most free, off-grid is great. I'm not off the grid, actually. Someday, I would like to actually move and be off the grid, but you don't have to start that way, and maybe you never even need to get that way. But it's the most freeing way to do it, where you make your own electricity, or God makes your own electricity for you. But also, how much does that cost to make electricity? It's actually quite expensive. So that's another thing to consider. You need to look into that if you're going off the grid at least. And another point that's not fun to talk about are rules and regulations. That's not fun. I wish this weren't such an issue, but in places like the EU and in certain regions, there's rules. You may find a nice piece of property that would be a perfect place for a garden, and you see a nice place where you could have a house, but there may be rules that say you can't build a house on this property. So if you want to build a house and have that on that property, and you find you can't, well, then that place is not for you, right? But also, like in Germany, I know Germany doesn't have a lot of individual houses, like I've said. They'll have small villages sometimes in the country, and then the farm properties are all around it, and then you have to go to yours. And that can be an option to do that. And I know there are some houses all alone in Germany. It's just not as popular. So you have to kind of make a decision what works best for you, what you can afford, and what region that it's in. So can you do agriculture on the property you're looking at? Some places it may be illegal. It might be a piece of land that is only for business. Like you could start a business there, but you can't grow food. So you have to find out the rules in for that specific property. And some places you could have a business there. And we were looking at a piece of property where they told us, you cannot have on this property a business that is offensive. Well, my thought was, okay, I made documentaries, and one of them is on the Antichrist. Is that offensive to somebody? Yes, so could they tell me you can't work on this property? Well, I thought, well, then I'm not buying this property because I don't even know. That's such a vague thing. You can't do a business that offends somebody? Well, there's nothing on earth that can't offend somebody today. At least in America, everybody's offended. Everybody's offended. So how could you even, I just wouldn't want a property with a rule like that. So I didn't get it. But we got another one. So some properties you can't build a fence. So just try to figure out what are the legalities on that in that area, whatever it is. And maybe you're okay with the legalities, but it's good to know what they are. Another one is, this may not be as big of a deal in Europe, I really don't know. But in the United States, you have to make sure you have legal road access or easements, and I'll explain what that is. Meaning, there are properties, my friend bought one. He found this property that was super cheap out in the country. It was a number of acres, so he bought it. But all the properties around it were owned by other people, and he wasn't able to get to it. So there was no legal way to get to his property. And so the good thing is he found a way of getting out of it after that. So it worked out okay for him, and he didn't lose any money. But that's a consideration. Do you have access to, can you get there? You may think, Chad, that's obvious, but he saw such a good deal, he figured, oh, I'll be able to get to it somehow, but he couldn't. So it's a very simple thing. And there's a term in the United States called easement. And that's where maybe I own some property, but maybe before I bought the property, somebody had a little road through my property to another piece of property. And it's good to know about that beforehand, and you may be fine with that. That can be okay. But maybe it goes right next to your house, and it would be kind of annoying to have maybe a business going right next to your house all the time. So it's good to know if somebody has legal access to part of your property. That may not be as much of a problem in Europe. I have no idea. You do have? Okay. So and keep in mind also, what I'm telling you are things, I do have some points here for Europe, but different countries have different things, so some may apply, some may not. Another thing to consider is soil quality. And you're not always going to be able to do like a soil test on a property. You know, like, oh, I'm going to come on and send it off to the scientist and find all they have for me to say. Now, if you could, that would be wonderful. But probably you can't do that. So the best you can do is go out on the property and take a look. And what I would like to do on a property personally, we have a saying in English, maybe you have it too, it's better to apologize than to ask for permission. And I would literally, if I'm going to buy a property, I'm going to dig down a little bit, take a little tiny shovel or something, and I'm going to dig down a ways to see what's under there. Because if you dig down this far and it looks wonderful, you may get to here and it's solid rock. So you can't grow a garden there unless you bring in tons of soil, but that's going to be a lot of money. Or you go down this far and it's pure sand. So your roots really aren't going to go any deeper than, you know, this tiny bit of... So if I'm going on a property, I am going to dig down. And maybe my wife will go with the realtor, and I'm going to be over there digging, and they come, what are you doing? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, now I know, right? I would rather find out and apologize than not know and spend tons of money on a property that I shouldn't have bought in the first place. So they probably would let you anyway. By the way, they should, if it's a country property, they shouldn't be afraid of you checking the soil, right? They shouldn't be afraid of it. So it shouldn't be a problem, but I'm going to find out beforehand one way or another. So you do want to see, does it look like decent soil? The other, if you're not living in the country, you probably don't know. But if you get to know the area you're living in, you can actually tell how good soil is to a degree by looking at the weeds that are growing. How well are the weeds growing? If the weeds are growing phenomenal, you're going to go, okay, man, there's some nutrients in this soil. If even the weeds look weak and pathetic, you know, it depends what time of year, obviously, because in the fall they're dying back. We're not talking about that. But if they don't grow well, that probably means it's lacking something. That doesn't mean it can't be worked on. It very well may be able to be worked on, but you want to get an idea of the soil quality. What's it like there? The next point, you don't need to live up in the mountain. It's just kind of a cool picture. But how does the land lay? What do I mean by that? Is it super steep? Is it flat? And what direction does it lay? So, for instance, if you're looking to do some agriculture, if you're in a mountain, and I'm not saying you all need to be in mountains, but if you happen to be in the mountains, sometimes it's cheaper in the mountains, sometimes it's more expensive. But let's say you find something, and it's sloped toward the north. Well, if it's sloped towards the north, it's actually going to be very cold. And it's not going to be very good probably for most agriculture. But if it's sloped to the south, the sun, I don't even know what way the south is now, but let's just say south is this way just for my illustration's sake so you can see it. So the sun is going to rise in the east, and it goes up over in the south, and it sets in the west. So if your land is I don't mean super steep, but if it's a little bit of a hill toward the south, you're going to get nice sun all day. But what if instead the sun goes over here and my land is on the north side? What's happening with the sun? It's not getting sun. Does that make sense? So you typically want some of your land, if you're in a hilly region, to be pointed toward the sun. You can actually grow some things sometimes on the colder side, like some fruit trees will actually do better because they won't sprout as fast in the spring, and they'll still do okay on the north slope. Some, not all. But the point is, in general, for a garden, you want to have good sun access. So that's, how does the land lay? Like for instance, if the sun was behind these mountains, this would be a very bad area. I mean, this doesn't look like a good area for agriculture, probably. It could be, maybe it is, but it doesn't look the best. But the whole point is, if the sun's always behind the mountain, it's probably not the best place to try to grow food. Also, different seasons in that area. What is it like? And are the roads even open? If you're in the mountains, I don't mean you all need to be there. I'm not in the mountains. I love mountains, but I'm not there. What is it like in the winter? It may be perfect in the summer, and then in the winter, there's areas of California, I'm not exaggerating, where there's this much snow to the ground. And so you're not going to get there in the winter. In the summer, it'd be amazing. You could grow things, it'd be perfect. But then several months of the year, you can't get there. That may not be a problem. Maybe it is up in Switzerland, way up in the mountains, I don't know, somewhere, or Austria, whatever. But how is it going to be? And one of the ways, you may be there and you don't know, but you can ask neighbors. You can go around and ask neighbors. And by the way, that's a very wise thing to do in general. Go get to know the community a little bit. Knock on a door. You think, oh, that's not our culture. Well, create your own culture and do it anyway, right? Learn to do these things. And so let's say you are in an area with a lot of snow. Does the city or the municipality, do they take care of the roads? Or are you so far out that you have to take care of the road yourself for a ways? And if so, like I don't know what it would be in, I should have figured it out, but my driveway is off a road, which is a dirt road, which is taken care of. But then from the street to my house on my property is almost a quarter of a mile. I don't know, not quite, maybe a half of a kilometer or something like that. So if I'm gone for a long time, like if I come home, I'm supposed to be traveling till December or something. I could come home and there could be so much snow I can't get back to my house. And we've done that. And then we have to get out of our car and we have to walk to our house. And, you know, we're okay with that. It's not super far, but it is a good way. I can clean it out afterward, but it just takes a lot of work for me. But those are the kind of things to think about. What are the different seasons like in your area? Another thing is, if you're going to work from home or if you need internet, do you have access where you are? The good thing these days is, I know there's satellite internet. I don't know, is there satellite internet in the rural areas of Europe also? Okay. I know. I just saw something in the news that Europe is kind of trying to fight Elon Musk because he's got the satellites all over and they're trying to build something else or whatever. I don't know all of that. But most places today you can get internet, even if it's by satellite. But can you afford it? Those are things to look into. But it's amazing. There are few places today in most civilized areas where you can't get cell phone service. Most places you can get that today. But there are areas in the United States where you can't get it, but there's not a ton anymore. Most areas you can get it. But if not everybody's trying to make a living on the internet, but if you are, make sure that you have accessible internet on your property or where you're looking to buy. So another thing to consider if you're going to build, remember if you already have a house that's already built, you don't have to worry about this. But if you're going to build, how much does it cost to get permits to build? I don't even know if you need to pay that in Europe, but in the United States we do. Some areas, it's very cheap. But in other areas, like California, even in the country, some areas, you spend $75,000 just for them to sign a paper saying you can build your house. That's crazy. You might be able to build a small house for that much money. And yet you have to pay that much money for nothing just for the government to tell you, yes, you can build. So maybe it's not that bad here. I have no idea. And I think they're doing that in California to keep certain people away. They only want rich people in this particular area. That's what they're doing. But I have no idea. Do you have to pay permits to build here? You do. Okay, yeah.
Especially in Switzerland.
Especially in Switzerland. I figure. Switzerland, yes. Everything's expensive in Switzerland, right? It's quite expensive here too, but probably even a whole nother level in Switzerland.
Just told that it was so many costs for this.
In California? That was California, yeah. It's very expensive. There for us, where we were in Michigan, it wasn't that expensive. We did have to pay, I don't remember, but it wasn't too bad. And another thing is, there's something called agricultural zones. And what does that mean? It can mean a lot of things, but what I'm talking about when I say this, you may have a different word in your own language, but in English, you can look up your area, whatever country you're in, and you can type in agricultural zone, and it will show you a map of what are called the agricultural zones. And what that means is it will give a number, like 1 to at least 10. I don't know if they go above 10. It might go above 10. But 1 to 10 at least, where you'll find out, oh, my area where I live in Michigan, it's a zone 5. What does that mean? Zone 5 tells me that what temperature it will get on average in the winter, how cold it gets in the winter. That's all it tells you. The agricultural zone will tell you how cold it on average gets in your region. And so let's say it's in Celsius. Let's say you live in an area, a pretty warm area, where it just gets to 0 every winter. That's a pretty warm region. But if you live in a colder area, maybe it gets to -10. Maybe a colder area, it gets to -20, maybe -30, -40, -50 up in the mountains in some areas. And so you knowing what agriculture zone you're in will tell you what kind of perennials are things like fruit trees. It will tell you what kind of fruit tree can you put on your property. So for instance, there are apple trees, not all apples. When you buy an apple tree, they will typically tell you, you can go online and it will tell you what zone you can plant your apple tree in. And so if you, for instance, there are apple trees that can grow in -50 degrees. Super cold. Alaska, up in the mountains. They won't die. They'll stay alive. But there's other apple trees that have to be in zone 6. So if you live in a zone 4 and you buy a zone 6 tree, your apple tree is going to die in the winter. Does that make sense? So you look up what agricultural zone you're in, and you plant only things like fruit trees that can go in yours. So if I'm in zone 5, I can plant trees that are 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Because I can plant trees that can grow in cold weather, because that's fine. But I can't, in zone 5, plant trees that are zone 6, because they'll die. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. And if not, if I'm not clear about something, it's my fault. Come talk to me. And don't be afraid. If I'm not clear, talk to me afterward. Don't ever be afraid to ask. I'd happily share. So, debt or no debt? Well, yeah, we would all love to have no debt. That would be wonderful. But, and some people say, well, don't buy a house because if you get a mortgage, then you're paying every month. Well, if you happen to have tons of money and you can buy with no debt, go for it. That's wonderful. But we do have Ellen White herself went into debt for at least one of her houses I saw. She was talking about it anyway. And so this is the thing, whether you rent, and there's nothing wrong with renting a country property either. That can be a great way to get out in the country. Obviously, it's even better if you can buy, but don't give up on the best just because it's not best. Still good to be out there. So, but if you can buy, wonderful, and most of you won't be able to buy without debt. But the good thing with if you do debt is make sure you can afford it, and if Jesus doesn't come in many years, then you may be able to pay it off, and finally you're done with that. I'm not promoting debt, by the way, but I am saying there's not much a difference between having debt and renting. It's really not that different. The only difference is debt, a mortgage, at least has a potential for getting out of debt and not paying somebody for the rest of your life. So, but I'm not saying don't rent. I actually think it can be a great way to get out in the country, can be renting also. So don't think I'm saying one without the other. My wife and I we had a few years where we made a decent living, many years where we were very poor, and then we had a few years where we made a good amount of money, and we just saved almost everything because we didn't have a house, we didn't live anywhere, we traveled, and so we tried to build a house and buy our land with no debt. And so we bought the land with no debt. We worked on the property. We got almost to the end of finishing the house, and then we ran out of money, and the person building it said, I need this much. And we're like, oh, we didn't know there was that much more to pay. And so we didn't have that. So we had to go get a debt. I'm not promoting debt, but praise the Lord, we've paid it off now, and that's done. So we don't have to pay every month. But don't listen to me. Allow God to lead you. Pray. You may say, Chad, but Ellen White talks about avoiding debt. She does, specifically to her nephew, who kept getting in debt. And most people use those quotes specifically. He was just getting in debt and just constantly living in debt for all kinds of stuff. You shouldn't, it's best not to do that. But the one thing that will actually increase in value, is a house. So that's typically going to go up, typically anyway, most of the time will go up in value. And so as you're paying it off, you know, if you have, I don't know how it works in Europe everywhere, but in the United States, there's two kinds of loans for a house. There's one called variable interest, where the interest, the amount you pay per month could change every month. Or we have fixed interest. That means the price will never change ever. You pay the same amount. And in 10 years, what you're paying today will seem like a whole lot less money, because money in the future, there'll be inflation. And so you'll be paying what people paid 10 years ago. And new people, if you're in an apartment, your apartment's going to cost much, much more in 10 years. Does that make sense? So I'm not telling you what to do with this. You have to, between you and God, make the decision whether or not to go in debt. If you don't have to, obviously that's the best route, or you can rent. Any of those are options. Another thing to consider, and I'm guessing most countries in the EU have this, are property tax. Do you have property tax in your countries? We do in the United States also. There may be some places, there are areas of Alaska with no property tax. If you buy the land, you're done. But boy, the weather's rough, you know. And it's not all of Alaska, it's just the rough areas. Like, they're like, yeah, you just live there, you do whatever you want, we don't care, because nobody's out there. And so if you want that, there's places to go with no property tax, but it's hard living out there. There may be other countries that I don't know of that don't have any property tax. That would be great. But we have to pay property tax. Can you afford the property tax? Because you don't think about that when you rent. When you rent, at least I'm guessing you don't pay property tax when you rent, right? The person you're renting from has to pay the property tax. But when you own a house, you not only have to pay your mortgage if you're buying it with debt, you also have to pay the government whatever they tell you you got to pay them. So make sure that you can find out what would the property tax be. Could you afford that every year? Also, another question is, do you have a way to make a living in the area that you're hoping to move? Now, if you work on the internet, you could live anywhere that you have internet. But if you don't work on the internet, what do you do for a living? Do you have practical skills? Can you work on cars? Can you build houses? Can you cut down trees? Or whatever. I mean, whatever it is. Do you have a way? Because some Adventists, they hear the country living message and they're just like, we got to go to the country. And then they run out and they can't make a living. And then they come back to the city and they say, oh, that's fanatical. Moving to the country is crazy. Well, it may be what they did was fanatical. But it may not mean that it's fanatical itself. Does that make sense? Because another person goes out there and just has the time of their life. They love it. They have such joy. Their children are happy. The whole family's happy. And another family, it's a nightmare because they didn't know how to make a living. They just ran out into the country with fear. And we don't want fear to be our director in life. We want Jesus to be our director, and we want to have a level mind, a balanced mind, right? Don't be fanatical. But do you have a way to make a living? And I'll tell you, I have some videos on my YouTube channel on ways to make a living in the country. It is crazy. There's so many things you could do. You could watch the videos. I can't even remember all of them. People told me things that they were doing, and I just told examples. And, I mean, some of them are as simple as, I mean, you could become a window washer. There are old people who live in the country who will pay you to come wash their windows. And you just give them a set price. You say, I'll wash the windows on your house for 150 euros. And some old person be happy. You come in there in 4 hours, you made 150 euro. I met a guy in California. This may not work everywhere, but he was in California. There's a lot of rich people there. This guy went around to parks with RVs, caravans, or what do you call them? Trailers, you know, like the houses you drive in, small drivable houses. What do you call them? Caravan, okay? So this guy, there's all these old people, and they're sitting around, and it's not easy to wash those things at a car wash. So this guy comes with rags in his truck, and he literally wipes them down, cleans the whole thing. It looks real clean afterward. He charges $400 per RV. He can do 2 in a day. That's $800 a day. Now, you can't do that everywhere. But when I heard that, I was like, he's making like a doctor's income. And he has no like degree. He has nothing, but he's making tons of money. My point isn't, and you may say, Chad, we can't do that here. And you maybe not, you may not, but there are jobs that are creative that even if you don't have a degree, that you would be surprised how many people outside the city who need help with something, and you could find a way to make a living in a way that maybe even nobody else has thought of. And like I said, on my channel, I have a bunch of things in there. Some people get angry and say, oh, you should know what you're doing, and you should actually. And I don't mind people getting angry at me on the channel. I really don't mind. But the point is just giving ideas, just ideas. Not that you have to do any of them, but there are options on how to make a living, even if you don't have the internet or whatever. Another thing is property lines. This is very important. I bought my land in Michigan, and one of my properties, what happened is somebody put little ribbons or flags, these little red like plastic. They had like, you could go through the woods and you could see the lines, and you're like, oh, this is the line right here. This is not my property. I'm just a picture here. But so you go through, and so I went through it and I thought, okay, here's this line, and then there's a line in the back, and then there's a line on the side, and then there's the road. And so I figured, well, this is it. Then we said that we wanted to have a surveyor. These are men who have the job of going around and legally finding property lines, because we wanted to know for sure what the property lines were. And it turned out that one of the property lines was 30 meters off. 30 meters. That's pretty far. Now, what if I would have built my house within those 30 meters? I would have built my house on the neighbor's land, and he would have come and said, you built on my land. Thank you for the house, right? That would have been a very, now, yes, there's big machinery that could move a whole house. They actually do things like that, but boy, would that be expensive. So one of the important things is to know legally what are your property lines. Because most places also will have a rule, you can't build a house closer than so many meters from the property line, right? So knowing those things is important, and that'll help you know where you can put things on your property. Knowing the property lines is very important. One of the nice things, it's not perfect. You may have it in Europe too. We actually have an app that is actually free, and I can go in the United States and I can turn this app on, and I can walk properties anywhere in America, and I can go, okay, here's the property line roughly about here. And it's going to be off by a little bit. I mean, it might be off by 3, 4, 5 meters, but it's not going to be off probably by 50 meters. I mean, it's going to be close enough. I would still rather pay somebody to actually give me the legal lines, but it will give you a close idea if I'm just out looking at property. It gives me a very close estimate of where the property lies. You may have it in Europe too, I don't know. I don't know what it would be called, but we have it in the United States. So knowing property lines is important, and this is not fun to talk about either, but you need to legally make sure you get, in the United States, we call it a title. You need it to be legally registered. I looked it up on the internet, and this is what I found here. There are registration requirements when you buy a property. In most EU countries, land ownership must be registered with the relevant authorities, such as the land registry, or how do you say that in Cadastre. There you go. Basically, the legal place, you want to make sure it's done. Because, I mean, hopefully you won't ever run into this, but there are people who may try to deceive you and tell you, oh, I own this land or whatever. You need to make sure that it legally transfers to you, and you don't just go giving somebody money to buy some land and they run off and they didn't even own the land, you know? Someone could meet you at a property and not even own the place. It's not likely to happen, but you need to make sure that you get the legal paperwork that proves and it's registered in your name so that land is yours. Now that's kind of obvious that, I mean, it's not obvious if you've never bought land, but it would be a nightmare if you didn't own it in the end. The next one is unusual, and it has to do with, this is just another way to look for property. Let's say you go into an area and you think, I love this area. I would love to live in this area. And you look on the internet and you don't really see any properties for sale, or maybe you do and you look at them and then you don't like them. But one of the ways you can do it, and I've had, I think multiple people have talked to me about this in the United States, and I realize the United States, we do things that not everybody does, but you could do it anyway. So they found an area they like, and they go around and they knock on some doors and say, hi, my name is Chad. I'm from Denmark. I'm not, obviously, but you get the idea. But boy, I love this area. I think it's beautiful, and I think my family would fit well with this community. You know, number one, it's kind of nice to, you know, do something like that. And I'm just wondering, do you happen to know anybody that is maybe thinking about selling their property or their house or land or whatever you're looking for? And they may go, no, I don't know anybody. I'm sorry. But you'd be surprised. Country people are generally very friendly. Most people in the countryside, they don't get a lot of visitors. So you doing it, it's an interesting thing that somebody's in their neighborhood. And there's been places in Europe over the last few years where they were literally paying people to come to these very small areas because they needed more people because they're dying, because everybody's moving to the city. So you might be able to find one of those young people where they'll actually give some money to young families or people who are potentially going to have families if they're under a certain age. So that's another option in Europe. Actually, they do that sometimes in the United States too, but I've read about that in Europe. And so that's an option. But as you go knock on the doors, you may meet somebody and they say, you know what? Johan down the road, I think he's thinking of selling. And the benefit of this is because sometimes people will give a deal to you that they won't give to somebody else. They just met you. Now they know your face. They know your name. They see you. And some people will just say, this is how much I want for it. And you may even know that's way lower than what others are asking for. That's actually too low. But that's what the guy wants, right? And so God can open doors in that way. We interviewed a family on my channel where, you know, I told you about that app where you can go walk property lines. That app, in America anyway, it actually tells you the property owner's name, and it tells you their address. So they may not live on the land that you go look at, but this family won't, and they saw land, and they went in the app, and there were a bunch of addresses, and they sent handwritten letters to multiple landowners and said, hi, my name is, and I think my name is Stacy, and my family and I want to move to the country, and we love this community. We think this is perfect for our family, that we could fit in well. I think she even sent pictures of her children, and you know, it's just very special. Who gets a handwritten letter in the mail, and especially from somebody that you don't know? And so she wrote to like 8 different people, and one person responded, and that one person was an old man, because some people, they would like to sell, but they just you know, the effort. Sometimes just to get up and go to a realtor, it's just, you just don't feel like doing it. But somebody goes out of their way to write to you. So this old man, he contacted her and said, yes, come look at it. So she and her husband come. They look at it with the old man, and he said, this is how much I want. And it was way less than they were asking for. And they said, are you sure that's how much you want? And he said, yes. They said, well, buy it. And so they ultimately gave the guy, they got the legal paperwork done. They bought the property. And then one of the neighbors on the road knew that they bought it and knew they wanted to put something on. Well, in the United States, sometimes we have these things called mobile homes. They're not actually mobile. They move there once and then they never move again. And some of them can be okay. They've gotten better quality over the years, but the old ones were often very poor quality. And so these people in the neighborhood didn't want a poor quality, junky house being put on this property. So one of the guys in the neighborhood owned a company that sold very high quality mobile homes. And he was on the street. And he found out that they bought this house. Well, he didn't want a low-quality house in his neighborhood. So they somehow got in touch with him, and he showed them this very nice house that you would never know is a mobile home. It looks like it's built as a standard American house. And they looked at it, and they're like, I don't think we'll have enough money for this. Well, he said, well, how much could you give us? He said. And they gave him a price, and it was way too low. And the guy said, okay, all right, we'll give it to you for that. And so they got a cheap property and a cheap house that looks beautiful out in the country. My point isn't, we didn't get all those benefits on my property. But God blessed us the way we did it. And some people may find that God opens doors that you would never imagine. One couple, this couple in England, they were renting a property and they were doing agriculture and making a living off the rented property with the agriculture. Well, the owner, for some reason, wanted to sell the house, and they said, you need to leave. And so, well, they had to move out of this rented property. Well, they still didn't have enough money to buy anything else. And somehow, one of the richest landowners in England heard of them. And he had thousands of acres. And he invited them to their office, and he said, I have all this land here. And he said, why don't you take a drive through it and just take a look at it? And they're like, okay, not knowing what he's doing. And so they drive around these thousands of acres. And there's cottages and different things throughout these thousands of acres. And then they went and drove all through it, and they saw how these beautiful different areas with fields and cottages and, you know, agriculture in different spots and forests in different areas. And then they came back to him, and he said, did you like any of it? They said, yes. And he said, well, what part? And they said, well, there was this one cottage with 10 acres. And he said, you can move in. And he said, well, how much? And he said, it's free. You can just move in. And so they got to move into this property. And then some organic, this company, so they wanted to start a farm there. And this company found out that they were moving there and wanted them to grow organic produce. So they said, we will give you 30,000 euros. We'll have all the greenhouses built for you. You don't have to pay us back. Just grow food for us, and then we'll buy the food that you grow. So they got all of this for nothing. And I don't want to make you think, oh, every one of you are going to get free property in the country, and it will just be perfect. But sometimes God works miracles for those who don't have enough. And we have the promise in country living that God has a home for those who are willing. Sometimes it might be a rich person letting you use their land. Other times, God will help you have a job where you can make enough money to buy something. Other times you may rent. There's not one answer to all of this. I share these things, and like I said, knocking in the community might be a great way to do it, to find a good deal or to find something that's not on the internet yet, but God opens a door that you never would have imagined. And the final thing, and then we'll have a few minutes if you have any questions. The final thing is the thing we started with, prayer. That was the first one, that was the last one, and you should be praying all the way through the process. Don't trust in yourself. Don't even trust in your own finances. Trust in God and allow God to direct you in everything that you do. Do we have any questions before we finish up? Or comments? Or you want to argue and tell me I'm crazy? That's okay too. I'll accept that also. Anybody, any questions or comments?
Is there like a sort of, do you know, sort of website or something where you have a global
properties? I don't know global. I have looked in Europe too, but it's always seems to be random site from the Netherlands or from, does anybody know, is there a European-wide website that is all property? It's not a thing. Okay, so yeah.
Every country has different
rules, regulations, and even websites, right? So in the United States, we do have nationwide, and it goes into Canada too, probably. So we have, you can just, it's kind of nice because there's so much to look at. But here, you know, it's tighter. But I really think countries like the Netherlands, if you're going to live in, if you're going to buy property, I almost think the whole knocking on doors thing in a rural area might be a great option for some of you, because I'm like I said, you may say, Chad, that's American, and you don't have to do it. But I think you'd be surprised. People just don't communicate a lot these days. We do all things through legal entities and so forth. People might actually be touched that an individual comes to them and is interested, and they may know somebody that can point you to the right person, and God may open a door. I think that's a really great option. I don't mean it's the only option, but it could be a very good one. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
I want to make a comment about fracking. That's an issue in America. I know it's an issue in Central America, and that's something that people need to be aware of. Is when they buy a property, they need to have the water tested in the area that it hasn't been poisoned.
You do need. Thank you. You do when you. We had a well drilled on our property, and praise the Lord, it was very good water. We test our water before we would drink any of it. So there are water tests you can do, and one of the difficulties about agricultural land is, sadly, often agricultural land is some of the most toxic land because they've been spraying for decades, toxins, and it goes down into the soil and it's in the water. So probably I don't live in an agricultural land, I live in the national forest, so people aren't spraying by me, so the water's very clean. But if you live in an agricultural area and you have a well, it's probably good to filter your water somehow just because of the toxins that may be there. And even if the water's not perfect, that doesn't mean you can't ever use it. You just want to make sure that you can filter it in such a way that is going to be safe for you and your family. Anybody else? Yes?
I think it's very important to be independent. Like, if I look to Europe, that you don't have a lot of electricity or gas, that you try to do it all by yourself. Because at a certain point, I think a lot of things will not be given anymore. And that's why I was thinking a little bit about the debts, because if you have debt and you cannot pay it back, then the community can say like, okay, you lost your job because of Sabbath, I say something, and then like 3 weeks later you cannot buy it anymore. What you have to your debts, and then it's finished. They just take your house and it's
But
done.
keep in mind, if you're renting, the same thing happens,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So either way, so
I
the
don't do
you know.
I do like buying and
Yes, yeah, the best thing is buying. I don't have any debt. And yes, that's the best way, but I don't want to make such a high bar that nobody could ever attain to it. You know, only rich people could move to the country. So you're absolutely right that the time could come, and we don't know the day nor the hour. It could be very soon. There's many things that look like it'll be soon, but probably some of your grandparents thought it would happen in their lifetime, and it didn't. And I don't mean to put off the end. I don't. That's not it at all. I believe Jesus is coming soon, but if we live too in fear, we may not do anything, and as a result, you could have done something, and maybe in 20 years, you could have paid it off, or whatever it is. So, but don't get me wrong. If you can afford it, pay it off.
we just in our family made the wrong decision. We had a wooden stove and we took them away, and we put something with gas, and now we had electricity, and then the way how you cook and everything. And then we had 1 day or 2 days we didn't have electricity because there was something. We couldn't do anything in our house. And then we were like so struck that we are not prepared.
Yes.
If something is happening, like, I don't know, it was in the States that there were 10 days that there was the weather, there was very bad weather, and people were 10 days without electricity.
Yep.
They died. They just like, there was somebody who put it on the screen, and they said like, in 10 days your life can be over because you don't have electricity if you're not like prepared that you have.
And let me share with you something about that. I know probably not even every place in the EU could you have a wood stove, but if you can, I think they are if you live in a colder region. My wife and I, we heat our house with wood completely when we're home. 100%, that's how we stay warm, and it makes our house very warm. And we have enough trees. I'm not saying everybody can afford this much land, but if you have if you have roughly 2 hectares of trees, and you're not in the desert. If you're in the desert, you need way more. But if you're in a normal kind of area like this where you get rain and all, 2 hectares will have enough trees. If it's filled with trees, 2 hectares of trees will have enough trees that you will never run out of firewood. So you can cut down trees, others will be growing, you can cut down more, and you'll have enough trees forever on roughly 5 acres, 2 hectares. So something to consider there. I'm not saying everybody has to have that, but that just gives you a little bit of an idea there. So it is good to be able to have, if you can, a wood stove in a cold region to keep warm. And so, yes.
First of all, regulations from every part. In Belgium, if you want to cut a tree, you have to go to the municipal and to ask, can I cut it? And they say, okay, if you put another one instead.
Yes.
Mostly.
Yes.
Mostly, but not,
Yeah.
it's not enough all the time. Second thing, if you have troubles with money, you will always have a kind of trouble, because property tax is every year. If you
Yeah.
can't pay it, they can take it away.
Yeah.
So you have to walk
Yes,
in faith and in God with prayer, because there is no possibility.
there's going to come a time where Ellen White says we do have to let go of everything. So we do the best we can until that time. We do the best we can until that time. And so, yes, and it is true. That's the difficulty with places being like in Brussels or city areas, obviously. The more populated areas, some places, you either can't cut down trees. California, strict regulations on trees, much of California. Where I live, I can cut down the whole forest if I want to. I don't, because I only cut down part of it. But the point is, you do have to consider those things. And if you really feel like being more free, some of the times we have to move out of areas that have too many laws. So, but we also need people in those places to share the gospel. So, and by the way, I do that also. I live in the country, but I can come to Europe and I can share the gospel in cities in Europe. I can share in cities in America. So it doesn't mean we're giving up on sharing the gospel. It just means our country property is our home where we go to after we're done our work in the city. Anybody else? I think there was another hand. Yes.
In some places you here in the Netherlands you may not use wood stoves anymore.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
So
Yep.
then you cannot.
I do believe their goal. I do believe the powers would like to have no more wood stoves at all. I think partly they would say it's pollution, but secondarily, I think there's too much freedom with a wood stove. They like people to be controlled. Yeah.
It's the same of grid. In Belgium, strictly by the law, you cannot be off grid.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have to follow the rules. You can say, I don't use your electricity, but you're connected,
Yes.
and you use separately your.
Yes.
That could be, but they will ask questions from, how does it come you don't use any electricity from us?
Yes.
Wow.
It's always something.
Yeah. Yeah. So once again, and typically the way it works is the further outside of cities, the cheaper the land, and the further outside of cities, the less regulations. Now, it can be different in different countries. Every country has its own laws, but that's the general concept. Further out, less regulations, and cheaper properties, because less people want to live far away from civilization. Anybody else? Yes?
Sometimes it seems that they say about country living that you should not have neighbors and things like that. What are your thoughts about it?
I mean, it's really nice to have privacy, but it's not always possible, especially financially. My wife and I, we do have privacy, but it's easier in the United States because things are cheaper. At least land is cheaper. It doesn't have to be that way. Ellen White herself said, I want a property where I walk out my front door and I don't see my neighbors. But she didn't say everyone has to have that. She was telling you her personal desire. And it is nice, I've got to say. I can walk right outside and nobody sees me. I mean, I enjoy that. But once again, you don't want too high of standards that nobody ever makes any. It would be like saying you can only buy the most expensive Mercedes or you shouldn't have a car at all. Well, it's like, well, no, that's not necessary. So don't get me wrong. It's nice. I like it. But do the best with the finances you have and where God leads in your life. So each one of us have to kind of go where. And you may find that in the beginning, Ellen White even talks about it, living in cities, then you move to the small villages. Then from there, you move to secluded places in the country. So it may be that you go on this progressive path also. So don't give up because you can't do everything perfectly in the beginning. And you will never have perfection on earth anyway. So do the best you can with what you have. Yes, sir.
Tying in with that question, What do you do about security? I mean, once you're on the property, you have a security issue, someone may come. And when you're gone for 3 months, so
That's
and
like-
God and the angels protect
Yes.
you, but there must be more to it, right?
That is like me. I'm gone for months, and my house sits in the middle of the forest. And I've had it for since end of 2019. I think partly in America, where I live, it's a lot of hunters. I don't hunt, but for where I live, they're probably afraid if they drove back there, somebody would shoot them. And so for this, you've got the nice American thing that you might get shot if you come. So that's I don't worry. Yes, and we have the bears too. Yes, but so I'm not looking to shoot anybody. I don't mean that, but that's kind of the American way. So country living, there's a little, but there are a lot of drug addicts even in the country in the United States, and they do break into places. For me, the nice thing is my house is so far off the road, nobody can even see that I have a house. But for most people, you're right. There can be, you can have cameras or you can do different things. We don't have anything. We leave it in the Lord's hands. And I don't really have a lot of stuff that if they broke in and they stole, I mean, I have a computer, but that's with me, and I don't have a television, and I don't really have, I have a bed and some, things that if they stole it, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world for me. I wouldn't like it, but, So I guess everybody needs to make their own decisions with that. To us, we have nothing protecting it. The angels, that'd be it. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, I think we're at the end of the time. Let's close with a word of prayer, finally, right? Heavenly Father, thank you so much that you love us. Thank you that we have a promise that you have a country home for those who are willing. Not because we deserve it, but because you love us so much. And that may not mean that you'll give it to us tomorrow. It took my wife and I years and years of praying and searching, and finally you opened the door. Lord, help us not to run off and be fanatical, to be extreme. But at the same time, if you are calling us, not to go too far behind like Lot. So give us that balance, Lord, of day by day walking in your will. Lord, may we be a blessing to, if we live in the city, may we be doing your work there. And if you call us to the next place, maybe it's a village. And if you call us beyond to even further regions, Lord, no matter where we go, may we be a light in the community that we live. And beyond that, may we even do work sharing your gospel, maybe even in the cities or other countries or other places in the world. Lord, may you use us. May our life not be focusing on self, although some things are important, like raising food and these kinds of things. We're told to do it. But Lord, may we not focus on self, but learn how to be a light in these last days. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Thank you all.